Welcome to From the Spectrum podcast. This is a podcast about autism. It is my goal to explain what is autism. I intend to use a mixture of scientific literature, personal experience, and opinion. With opinion, I will explain why I feel the way I do and give examples. I will provide links to various references for each episode. For each episode, we will discuss various aspects of autism. For today's episode, we will discuss biological aspects implicating the excitation and inhibition balance. The EI balance is a worthy discussion with autism and a lengthy discussion. Today's episode is part 2 of a 2-part series covering the EI balance. Notice, not all of the topics covered are a cause of all the cases of autism. Autism is a genetic patchwork. It is not one gene, and not all gene implications reach autistics in the same manner. The cause of all autistic phenotypes are unknown. I want to warn you, you need to know some literature, and even some literature I have shared on autism, are attempts to create pharmacological help. This has concerns. This has concerns because of our medical paradigm, which likes and maybe even prefers prescriptions as the first line, as something that gets lots of financial backing, and it isn't hard to know why. I want you to understand autism, and I want you to make informed decisions. For today's episode, we will cover metabolic demands, glutamate and GABA, some neuromodulators like serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Remember, that's adrenaline, and acetylcholine. Also, N-methyl D-aspartate, which is NMDA and AMPA. Remember, feel free to look up the nomenclature to AMPA. We will also discuss a couple of brain networks, the Thalamocortical and the medial Prefrontal Cortex. Also, learning and memory. Remember neuroplasticity. Remember, this is essentially occurring in the background as certain cells are firing and making us more of what we are. This is the basis of who we are. So, the excitation inhibition creates a noisy and metabolic demanding condition. This can create crash or burnout or avoidance. This could mean the interaction, if chosen or when it cannot be avoided, is very demanding. Or, more accurately, it could be or it likely will be demanding. This explains a lot of criteria A. That alone helps explain a lot about autism. Metabolic demands, keeping up with the demanding outside world, paying attention and making sense of everything, and consider that rate of information we previously discussed, that fire hose of information. We keep track, at least our brain or body does, of our metabolic account. We meaning our brains. We meaning people. Lisa Feldman Barrett compares it to a bank account. Do I have enough resources to cover whatever task or environmental demand I am navigating? Or will that task demand calls me a metabolic deficit. Will I overdraw my metabolic account, my metabolic resources? Excitation is demanding. It works the sympathetic nervous system, the get up and go side. Inhibition is calming and quieting. Remember, it shuts systems down. It works the parasympathetic side, the inactivating and relaxing side. Remember, glutamate is excitation, GABA is inhibition. In autism, glutamate is more behavioral symptoms and GABA is more sensory processing, and not limited to just those. Criteria A and B are downstream of these conditions, meaning a result of or a response to. Because of the excitation inhibition, we get criteria A and B. Possibly a sequela of the abnormal brain development, whatever that looks like for the autistic. NMDA, N-methyl D-aspartate. NMDA increases signaling between cells. It excites cells and connections. It is common. NMDA and AMPA have spatial relationships, meaning they are often close and work alongside each other for the overall goal and intentions of the cell, which in this case is excitation or activation. NMDA and AMPA are excitation receptors for glutamate. Dopamine modulates glutamate release. Remember, dopamine has many functions in the human body, much more than most know. Here, dopamine starts glutamate, remember, to activate. And glutamate carries out several physiological responses in the nervous system. Synaptic plasticity is the basis for learning and memory. Remember, essentially, this is neuroplasticity, becoming who we are. Our old friend, the striatum, is a region of interest. Remember the striatum, and the ventral striatum is the nucleus accumbens. Think of it as a subdivision within a larger community. The striatum is where motor movements essentially begin, and decision-making, goal-directed task, social behaviors, habit, and emotions. So, once again, we uncovered many bases of autism symptomology. The data on AMPA shows social implications. Further, the data show AMPA dysfunction does not affect repetitive behaviors and cognitive deficits. In autism, AMPA can have hyper or hypoexcitatory transmission. Again, hinting on the spectrum and the ability to navigate certain environments differently. For repetitive type symptoms, this looks to be more NMDA. Additionally, and on the theme of neuroplasticity and or synaptic plasticity, AMPA receptors are crucial for memory. When BD and F from our previous episode, NMDA and or AMPA are inhibited, massive impairments occur. The EI imbalance occurs. Remember, that is not limited to autism, but certainly a factor in autism. Neuromodulators. Okay, we discussed aromatic amino acids, tryptophan and tyrosine. These two special proteins account for the synthesis of most neuromodulators. Remember, neuromodulators are slightly more complex than neurotransmitters, even though they are essentially the same. Neuromodulators are serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. These are crucial for the functioning of the human body and the nervous system. With that, deficiencies of these are not necessarily related to autism directly. However, remember, dopamine in the human body is much, much more than the wanting, the pursuit, the craving we think of. And serotonin is likely the most studied neuromodulator within this class for autism, dating back to the 1960s. Remember the 16p11.2 discussion. Serotonin is about having and helps determine active coping versus passive coping. In other words, how you respond to events perceived as unwanted or aversive. A subregion of the thalamus is involved here too, the lateral habenula. And lots is going on here with avoidance, feelings, social behaviors, so more of that, and adapting, sensory integration, and perhaps even more larger system integration. So consider that on the superpower to superdeficit spectrum. Mainly with neuromodulators, each modulator kind of owns a piece of brain real estate. For serotonin, remember having is the raphe, an area in the brainstem. Dopamine is the substantia nigra, and also melanin is huge here from a previous discussion, and in the ventral tegmental area. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, remember brain adrenaline, is the locus coeruleus, and acetylcholine, used for focus, it modulates focus, is the basal forebrain, or specifically, the subdivision, nucleus basalis. Remember, these things activate and inactivate whole systems or regions of the nervous system. The topic with autism is those modulators and those specific regions implicate the cell activity and subsequent glutamate and GABA and the cortical and subcortical communication, because in large part, autism has the implications and connection, possibly through myelin or axonal impairment, synaptic impairments, any of the developmental regions of interest that we have discussed. The list and discussion on these incredible neuromodulators is no way near exhaustive. One thing to note, and I did not specifically search for any data, but acetylcholine and muscle movement. Is this implicated in autism? I don't know, but acetylcholine controls muscles, and the reason why I wonder is of the motor movement symptoms with autism. Lastly, the nicotinic receptors for acetylcholine are not only excitable, but considered a rapid excitation. It's like giving the car extra gas for acceleration. Acetylcholine is used for our focus, how and where we will use our metabolic energy. A crucial area in the brain is the medial prefrontal cortex. The medial prefrontal helps determine how we feel, our mood, in real time or during thought or planning. Remember, we run models of how we will feel and do as we navigate the world. All of us do, autistics or not. A buzzword in neuroscience is the default mode network. Briefly, because it will be too much for this episode, the default mode network is a state of being during periods of no task demands. Well, for autistics, we have plenty of tasks. Remember the criteria B. We have task and interest. In other words, how others experience this state of a lack of demands. Autistics being isolated to ourselves, we can thrive in this time. And because of neuroplasticity, we can prefer this time. The medial prefrontal cortex uses glutamate and GABA, of course, especially GABA, to quiet the body during planning. Recently, it was found by Nolan Williams, the medial prefrontal cortex sends signals down to the heart and slows the heart down during those excitable states, during those unwanted states. Anyway, high excitation impairs information processing in the medial prefrontal cortex, especially social and cognition. GABA sets corresponding thalamocortical circuits. Here we are talking about those connections and communications, cells traveling and activating and inactivating systems. Remember, the thalamus is the hotspot, a hotspot for the senses and sensory processing. The thalamocortical is the path from the thalamus to the cortex. It relays sensory information and integrates it with appropriate systems. The medial generates social responses, behavioral flexibility, inhibition of responses, and attention and emotion. Remember two things. Don't consider a singular area to be the only place or thing responsible, such as attention or emotion is the medial prefrontal. Nothing in the human body is singular. 2. The medial prefrontal is very metabolically demanding. It requires a lot of energy and resources. Remember the CNT-NAP2 discussion. A lack of inhibitory responses complicates socialness and cognitive flexibility. And you can see this with traits of autism. So right there, that's criteria A and B. We just highlighted key components for each criteria. In the background, the foot soldiers of our brain and nervous system are those neuromodulators, such as serotonin. Remember, VAST for socialness and active versus passive coping. And dopamine. Where do we want to provide energy for our pursuits? Sapolsky says dopamine isn't about the pursuit of happiness. Dopamine is about the happiness of pursuit. And I challenge you to explain it any better than that on the cellular level of wanting. Dopamine is wanting. Serotonin is having. This is a healthy balance. Many things in our biology can be seen on that seesaw. Remember the seesaw with the glutamate and GABA. And remember, as a response to those neuromodulators, glutamate and GABA are also constantly running in the background. All the while, neuroplasticity is occurring, strengthening of connections at the synaptic level, strengthening those synaptic connections. A crucial consideration, especially with autism, a crucial consideration is more sensory input equals faster firing rates of the items discussed today. That is a normal EI balance. So in other words, to repeat, more sensory input equals faster firing rates of the items discussed today. This is a condition with a normal EI balance. Now, imagine when the EI is imbalanced. Imagine the firing rates now. Today's discussion and the previous episode highlights opportunities for superpowers and superdeficits. Now, you don't get to determine this. It is the responsibility of others to help people with autism to find their superpowers. Nobody controls the rate of information autistics have. Nobody controls what superpowers each autistic will receive. In addition, it is also up to the autistic, when possible, to find their superpowers. However, the lay public and the surrounding people cannot and should not limit people with autism. One of the best things you can do for autism is just delete everything you know about autism and then relearn it. Learn what autism is actually. And whenever I say delete, just go ahead and wipe it out. But don't worry. Our memory in the human brain is often like the memory on our computer. You're not actually going to delete it completely out. It will still be there in the background. You can still retrieve it. My point is, don't limit your capacity to think. Don't be offended by people asking you to think differently, to expand your critical thinking, especially on this autism phenomena. Don't try to change an autistic person because they are different than you or different than others. Don't let that offend your beliefs and capacity to apply critical thinking in life. If you are listening and enjoy the episode, if you enjoy the podcast, please feel free to leave a review and/or rating. In podcasting, reviews and or ratings are huge. And I very much appreciate your feedback. If you would like to contact me, please email me at info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.